Alright, gentlemen, in this video we're going to talk about the Constitution and the guiding principles behind it. You've looked at the Articles 1 through 7 as well as the amendments and are quite familiar with some of the terms that are used in there. In other words, the structures of the legislative, executive, and judicial branches, as well as the individual rights that are afforded to each and every American citizen. In this video, I'm going to briefly talk about 4 key guiding constitutional principles and then highlight 3 others that are not included in this set of slides. So let's jump right in. The 4 principles that guide the shaping or the 4 key ideas behind every article in the Constitution are separation of powers, checks and balances, federalism, and limited government. Next, I'm going to dive into each one, talking very specifically about some of the examples of each of these things, and then finally wrapping up with the 3 remaining principles. Separation of powers. Separation of powers is a way of dividing power among the 3 branches in which members of the House, Senate, President, and federal courts are selected by and responsible for different areas of the government. So, in short, what this means is that power is divided evenly among the 3 branches. Now for concept 2. Checks and balances. Checks and balances is a government structure that gives each of the 3 branches of government some degree of oversight or check and control over the actions of other branches. So the example I always use in class is that to make laws, Congress, both sides, must pass the law. It then lands on the president's desk, the president being the executive branch, the leader in the executive branch. He can sign it into law, veto it, or do what's called a pocket veto or silent veto. If that law then passes the president's desk and becomes a law, it then is tested in the courts. So the judicial branch, the Supreme Court being the highest one of the federal courts, tests or interprets each law. Concept 3, federalism. Federalism, like separation of powers, talks about dividing power equally, but in this case it's between the national government and state governments, in which independent states are bound together under one national government. So we've done a chart that kind of outlines the responsibilities of the federal government and the responsibilities of state governments. Federalism is the concept, the guiding principle that the framers used to invoke these rules. Concept 4, limited government. Government or limited government is a type of government in which functions and powers are written, limited, and restricted. So the 3 key things are that the government is limited, the rules of the government are written down, and that each branch is restricted to only what is written down. Some examples of these are that the national government cannot violate the Bill of Rights, may not impose export taxes to each state, and may not change state boundaries. State governments, on the other hand, cannot print money, may not tax imports or exports, and may not suspend a person's rights without due process. Now for some other principles that guide our Constitution. You've heard mention of the Bill of Rights, and Thomas Jefferson talks about natural or unalienable rights. That concept that guides the shaping of our amendments, our first 10 specifically, is individual rights. Secondly, we've talked about in each of these areas the people electing representatives. The fact that the people elect individuals to represent their ideas, that principle is called republicanism. Lastly, what I'm going to do in class is go through each of these cartoons and ask you to interpret the meaning of the cartoon as well as what principle this cartoon represents. There are no right answers, but what I'd like for you to do is take a moment for cartoon 1, jot down what principle is represented, what some of the symbols mean, pick 2 symbols and describe what they mean, and then what message is the cartoonist trying to get across. You can pause the video and write this in your notes now. We're going to now jump to cartoon 2. For cartoon 2, I'd like you to do the exact same thing. Write down 2 symbols in the cartoon, tell me what they mean, what constitutional principle is represented, and lastly, what is the message of the cartoon. Pause the video and do that now. Cartoon 3, the exact same activity. You may pause now. And lastly, cartoon 4. Cartoon 4, what constitutional principle is represented, what is the message, and what are 2 symbols in this cartoon that show that message. Thank you, gentlemen. You should upload your notes to On Campus and respond to the discussion question. All right, see you in class.